Bonjour, je me présente, Gwénaëlle Roscoe. Je fais partie de la cabane sensorielle. Nous sommes sur Rennes et nous sommes une clinique spécialisée en intégration sensorielle et voulons importer aussi beaucoup d'éléments sur la neurobiologie, neurophysiologie, les termes régulation, co-régulation, les termes euh, neuroception sont des termes qui sont proches à notre pratique. Et puis, le terme trauma développemental est aussi un terme que nous utilisons beaucoup. Ce sont des concepts qui ne sont pas forcément très utilisés dans le quotidien des ergothérapeutes, des professionnels en France. J'ai invité Kim à venir partager avec nous pour parler de ces termes-là. Donc, bonjour Kim. Euh,
Bonjour Gwen. Bonjour Gwen.
Et tu es une conférencière, tu es une ergothérapeute canadienne, conférencière qui voyage à travers le monde pour pouvoir amener un peu toutes ces connaissances-là. Tu as reçu aussi l'émérite, la médaille d'émérite je l'ai en anglais, excusez-moi, de l'Association nationale des ergothérapeutes canadiens en 2019. Et puis aujourd'hui, j'ai l'honneur et puis j'ai une chance de pouvoir avoir ce temps de partage avec toi. Lorsqu'on a préparé ce temps d'échange, la question était quel sujet nous allions aborder. Et trois sujets, trois thèmes sont, je pense, une bonne représentation de l'approche holistique globale qu'est l'approche psychosensorielle. Ben voilà, je m'inspire des questions que je peux te poser qui seront inspirées de ces trois sujets.
It is such an honor and a little bit overwhelming to have this capacity to come and speak about something that I'm so passionate about in your town, in your country, and in connection to your clinic, Gwen. And so this opportunity is deeply meaningful to me and also to our company Relationship Matters, which is so committed to the idea of helping people understand why people do what they do. And our mission is the conscious evolution of the human spirit. So I am very grateful for this conversation where we get to introduce what we're going to do together in October 2024 in Rennes.
Bien, le thème donc à Rennes, ce sera le 3 et 4 octobre à Rennes, sur le thème de développer une approche psychosensorielle et qui est pour tout thérapeute qui voudrait développer une alliance thérapeutique, qui voudrait développer une compréhension de son client dans une approche très holistique, au-delà des compétences professionnelles de base. Je vais commencer avec une première question. Euh, la régulation, qu'est-ce que la régulation? Plutôt que la régulation, qu'est-ce que le stress? Et comment il nous impacte dans notre quotidien? Et ça fait le lien avec la régulation dont tu vas nous parler.
Hmm. In beginning to talk about stress, one of the very key components that is often not considered is as the therapist, as the parent, as the teacher, our role in regulation of ourself. And that is why this matters, is that in order to co-regulate or support the nervous system of a child, we have to really deeply be able to do that in our own body. And this requires a tremendous amount of compassion for ourselves, care for ourselves. That when we interact with a child or a parent of a child that we are supporting, there is a likelihood that our own history of trauma, of our childhood experiences, becomes activated. And this creates a dysregulated state in us. And interestingly, The brain of the other person is like a tuning fork to our brain. And when someone is dysregulated and we are connected to ourselves through compassion, then our brain becomes the grounding rod for the other brain and allows the other brain to know what to do, to feel safe and secure and connected in themselves. This is invisible. So when we are stressed, we also bring that stress into the session and into the nervous system of the other person. So care for us matters. And this is the primary concept of psychosensory intervention. It's not what do I do to make the child be different. It's how do I show up in the session to help the child's brain learn something new in the way that they take care of themselves.
Est-ce que ça peut être aussi lié avec le sentiment de devoir être dans le moment? Could it be linked with a feeling of needed to be in the moment?
Absolutely, Gwen. This idea of presence is a part of that. And many of you may have heard the statement, leave yourself at the door when you come into the therapy room, which is actually impossible because I may do things in my actions that are not congruent with my inner feelings. And the sense of co-regulation is the invisible part. What is going on behind my behavior. And being present, being in the moment, requires that I have my mind in me and the child at the same time. That we are made up of a you and a me, and I, as the therapist, have a divided mind. I'm noticing what's going on for me, and I'm noticing what I'm seeing in the child. And this requires a lot of presence, where I'm not thinking about the goals and objectives that I have to achieve necessarily in that second, or what I'm going to make for dinner, or all of the other things that could come into my mind. My mind is quite present and tracking this dynamic that's going on between myself and the child.
And this is how you call it co-regulation?
So in co-regulation, this is that dance that goes on between the clinician and the child and the parent. So when we think about stress, that's what we're regulating. We're regulating many aspects of the child's nervous system that is contributing to their behavior. And in this image on the screen, where it says, what is psychosensory intervention? The therapist in this image is attuned or tuned in to the child's state and is wondering, is curious, why is this child needing help? Is it their attachment trauma that they bring into the therapy session? Is it their sensory dysregulation, their differently wired brain, where senses are coded and interpreted and responded to differently? Is it the child's body? And most of the time, it's all of those things. And so in this dynamic of this picture, which looks like play, the therapist is holding in mind multiple reasons for what are contributing to what they see, and then multiple choices of treatment that they can pull from, like an a la carte menu, that could be introduced in the moment of responding to the child's nervous system. This is co-regulation. So deeply connected to all of the holistic aspect of what the child actually may require moment by moment in order to become more capable in their participation. There are many stressors. Typically, at least in my own learning, we were taught to look for cause and effect. We use the word here in English, an antecedent. What just happened that resulted in this problem? Was it a sound? Was it a touch? Was it a siren on the street, a plane overhead, the tag in the shirt? These are important, but typically a dysregulated state that creates a challenging behavior is many things that are stacked together. Multiple loads of stressors, where the child finally can no longer contain it. And when we think about stress, there are different kinds of stress. Not how does stress feel, but what can we expect in recovery? In a normal everyday life, stress is necessary. I need a little bit of it to get excited enough to want to try something new, to push myself a little bit outside my comfort zone, to be able to develop. I'm thinking of an example. I'm visiting my brother and sister-in-law and their children right now as I am talking to you in the United States. And we went rock climbing, wall climbing last night. And my sister-in-law did it for the first time. And I watched the movement from a little bit of fear to excitement to competence. And it was just magnificent. This is how we grow and evolve, is with this chemistry of stress. And then there's recovery in there. I get this chemistry of in my system, and then I can restore myself. What becomes problematic is when I can't.
The example that is very common to anybody, any culture, is a cuckoo.
Yes.
That the parents does, hiding, and suddenly, oh, me voilà, oh, everything is good. Is that what you refer to? Le jeu de tout à chacun, de coucou, c'est moi, coucou, où est-ce que maman est, est-ce que papa il est, ah, là voilà. Ce jeu-là, il est empreint d'inquiétude pour finalement, tout va bien.
That is a perfect example where gaining the baby's interest in us is a little bit stressful and exciting. And then the baby gets a chance to recover. And this is the kind of games we play with babies all the time, to develop connection with them. And this is healthy stress. Perfect. Our children who experience trauma, and we're going to talk about developmental trauma in a second, who experience day after day after day experiences that challenge their nervous system from fear, it stacks up and it actually changes the brain's and the body's ability to manage the stress response. The child or the adult can get stuck there, living in chronic anxiety. This is so common in our world today. And this is not a normal recovery, where I am operating in life from this place of fear as my beginning. And this is unhealthy. Unhealthy for relationships, unhealthy for my body, unhealthy for my learning. And so our children who have adapted to stress, chronic stress, are quite limited in their capacity to function. This is a big part of our work, is to help them find the way to recover. And thirdly, we have kids who are stuck in post-traumatic stress, permanent states, where they actually are outside of reality some of the time. They are what we call dissociated, disconnected. They may engage in things like self-harm. They may have the inability to leave their house. They may have difficulties with wanting to take their own life. These are stressors along the continuum. And some of us as clinicians support those children and often feel helpless at times to know what to do. And so this continuum is part of what we are going to learn how to meet and treat in this course.
Kim, tu as mentionné à un moment donné le trauma développemental, on va en parler un peu, mais ça m'a amené tous les points que tu présentais, m'a amené aussi le fait que quand on fait une anamnèse, parfois on voit déjà des éléments qui on peut voir associés avec un stress très élevé. Ça peut être lors de la grossesse, ça peut être une hospitalisation et petit, etc., une situation de conflit ou de difficulté familiale. Est-ce que dans ces moments-là, il nous faudrait déjà penser au trauma développemental et quels sont les signes qu'on peut prendre en compte pour pouvoir aller un peu plus loin que le suivi qu'on fait habituellement pour un enfant qui vient avec des troubles du processus sensoriel ou un problème orthophonique, un problème dans le mouvement, dépendant de quel professionnel voit l'enfant.
This is such a good question. When this slide says it all, really, that trauma is in the eye of the perceiver, meaning what is traumatic to one is very different to another. And traditionally, at least in my own practice, the kind of stress that was most common in my assessment was related to sensation. That the stress response that I was observing in challenging behavior came from the way that the nervous system of so many of the clients that I was treating perceived and experienced the world. The feeling of overwhelm that comes from autism, for example, or from children who experience sensory processing challenges, going to the mall where there is a difficulty in integrating multiple pieces of data in a fluid way is experienced by the nervous system as often a trauma experience. And so really when we're talking about trauma, that word means taking a stress response way out on the continuum to a place where I deeply struggle to cope. And so in response to your question, my assessment is looking for different variables that are contributing to what I'm seeing in the person's way of adapting to the world around them. And developmental trauma is one of them. In Europe, developmental trauma is typically called attachment trauma because it is stress responses that happen in the context of relationship. This is what's so important about the identification of it. So if you think about my example a moment ago of autism, the variable there, chaos, came from sensory perception. In developmental attachment trauma, the chaos and stress comes from the relationship. And sometimes they look similar in how they appear in the child's presentation. But where they came from was different. So children who experience neglect, children who experience abuse, children who witness domestic violence in their home or hear and feel a tremendous amount of judgment and criticism, children who experience bullying in school, which occurs in the context of relationship. These are the kinds of stressors that can also change the brain and thereby show up as challenging behavior. And ultimately, these two things interact. What happens came from a different direction, but they affect each other. So the attachment trauma affects the sensory systems, and the sensory systems affect how we have relationships. So they're very interconnected, and why we need to understand how they fit together, because no matter who you have in front of you, we want co-regulation through relationship and sensory understanding so that that hand in glove become more safe and secure.
Maintenant qu'on connaît un petit peu le trauma développemental, est-ce que les troubles alimentaires pédiatriques pourraient avoir une origine, en quelque sorte, ou une partie en tout cas, avec le trauma développemental?
That question makes me grin because when we think about measuring regulation, states of regulation, which means how well do I manage my arousal, there are three biggies in child development that are a reflection of the proficiency of regulation. And they are sleeping, eating and feeding, and toileting. And they are systems that require a lot of co-regulation in relationship. So sleeping, eating and feeding, and toileting are not just body functions. They occur and develop in the context of attachment. And that's why they are a good skill to choose for the analysis of things holistically. And eating and feeding is so complex. So when I'm launch in here to my answer to your question, please don't think that every child that comes with a eating and feeding challenge has developmental trauma. In fact, the reason it's a good question is because rarely do we think that developmental trauma is connected to eating and feeding. And now it's one more variable for us to think about. You know, this term self-regulation is a concept that is so important and often misunderstood. So self-regulation, which is the ability to, this is according to one of my 7-year-old clients, feel my feelings, express my feelings, and then move and organize my behavior. Whereas typically adults think that self-regulation looks like compliance, looks like do what I tell you to do. And these are antagonistic principles. So in order to learn self-regulation, a baby, a toddler, a child, an adolescent you really don't learn to self-regulate till you're in your mid-20s if you're female, and 30 if you're male. And that's a big statement, because what we expect from children is often more than they can do. So when we are with our children across that time span while their brain is developing, from newborn until mid-20s, we are still helping them dial up and dial down when they are dysregulated. And what we really need to teach, so to speak, is the feeling of being comfortably uncomfortable. To be able to feel the range of my feelings, big and small, and know that they are all equal in value and provide information to my social emotional intelligence. And this is not what we typically learned, at least this is not what I learned. I learned that the only emotion that was valuable was happiness, and that other emotions needed to be seen and not heard. And subsequently, I didn't learn to feel them and express them in a healthy way. And this is very destructive to our relationships.
Mm-hmm. I do have one thing is when a therapist are helping in self-regulation, they usually try to point out when the person is dysregulated to come into regulation. But some people never had that regulation at base. So isn't it at times we need to reinforce what I call the green zone where the person feel safe, and there to then after bring up the self-regulation. Donc il y a parfois on est amené à pointer plus quand il y a une perte de régulation pour pouvoir essayer d'emmener vers la régulation. Mais pour autant, euh, quand on regarde l'enfant, cet enfant-là ne peut avoir jamais réussi à connecter avec qu'est-ce que la régulation, se sentir bien, sentir le bien-être. Donc en fait, on est en train d'amplifier sur quand ça ne va pas pour pouvoir trouver quelque chose qui n'a pas vécu. Est-ce que c'est un élément que tu pourrais, que tu serais avec lequel tu serais d'accord, ou comment approcher ça? How to approach that concept?
Gwen, I'm smiling because you are so intuitive and so brilliant in this statement. Because what happens in attachment trauma is that the learning of the feeling of regulation and being at home in your own self is often never achieved or rarely experienced by the child as home base. And so asking cognitively for a child to come into that knowing isn't possible because it's not part of their reference point. And for kids that experience that degree of challenge in their history, in their relationships, when they come into safety in our presence, it can feel completely foreign. That safety can actually feel dangerous because my brain will adapt to the environment in which I live. And so many kids, for example, in schools, the teacher may have this beautiful capacity to connect with the child and offer a feeling of love and safety, and the child's brain doesn't have a clue what to do with that, and will exaggerate unconsciously their negative coping adaptations to create the familiar outcome. And we think this is all conscious, that kids are sitting up thinking, how am I going to irritate my mom? How am I going to irritate my preschool teacher? that this is all very underneath consciousness, and it came from survival. So your point about the zones through verbal attention to the place of what zone are you in? How are you feeling now? What might you be doing differently? These are all cognitive requests for embodied attunement that is the hardest thing to do. And so this is where the sensory systems come in. Because if I've never felt my feelings, I'm never going to learn how to regulate them. And feelings are sensations. So this is another great example of where psychosensory intervention brings these two concepts together in the learning.
Great. Thank you. That's very clear. Et où est-ce que cette partie, la partie co-régulation rentre en jeu?
So in this image, the mother who has the more mature brain, this always falls to the adults because hopefully they have the wiser brain, is able to put her mind into the mind of the child. And this capacity is a curiosity. It's like the parent develops a working theory about what the child is experiencing and responds as if they were the child. Oh, you're sad right now. That must have hurt. I see you have big feelings. You're stomping your feet and you're mad. You really want that. Our role in co-regulation in early childhood is to help children learn to make sense of their feelings so that the feelings that they have, the expressions that they give, and the language they put around it becomes a package. And this is co-regulation. And when the parent doesn't get it right, which is often, the child will communicate, you don't get it. And so the parent gets ongoing opportunity to develop their working theory and create new meaning making along the way. This is what we call the internal working model, where we as adults carry our parents in our head, for better, for worse. We carry them with us when they're not there. And so the child learns, I come to you, adult, for safety, for protection, for security, for comfort. And then I leave you to explore the world, to learn, to be with other people. But I know that you have my back. You're still there with me, even though you're not with me. And this is attachment.
Et en fait, ce premier lien d'attachement se trouve dans l'allaitement. La première fois où l'enfant va connecter avec sa mère va être certainement au sein de sa mère. So the first link of attachment is in breastfeeding, isn't it? When the child is coming and latch on his mother's breasts and find that connection. Is that where it starts with the feeding?
Actually, Gwen, it starts in conception, ironically, where the experience of the mother is felt by the baby. And when mom's heart rate changes, baby's heart rate changes. When mom's levels of stress change, baby's stress response changes. And so this physiological co-regulation is actually beginning before birth. But it's done at a different level in the brain. That's at the brain stem. As soon as the baby is born, now the co-regulation starts to happen in the cortex, which is the thinking brain, where the caregiver, the parent, mom or dad, is communicating back and forth through nonverbals. The power of breastfeeding is oxytocin, which is the chemistry of love. And during breastfeeding, the oxytocin levels are high for both mom and baby. And this is soothing chemistry for both of them that is very powerful in the regulatory dance, where they learn to actually comfort each other in that connection. Such a cool question you asked. And this is feeding, part of eating and feeding. So if there is a disruption right there in lactation, the attachment is different.
There are cultures that are really prevalent in not breastfeeding, in bottle feeding. So, will they be impacted by that? Les cultures où ils sont beaucoup plus prévalentes avec le biberon plutôt que l'allaitement. Est-ce que finalement, il y a des facteurs qui sont là qui pourraient influencer l'attachement?
You know, I think, I'm not sure if in France or in any French country you have Netflix, but if you do, there is a series, television series called Babies. And one of the episodes of Babies talks all about this question. That in fact, mom, biological mom, her milk, the proteins and the content of the immune chemistry in her milk is different for each child. This is mind-blowing to me. That even in twins, what mom will produce will be individualized microbiologically for each child. So
Amazing.
Think about that the value of breast milk is so powerful as a resilience factor and a protective factor for the developing child. However, I don't want to leave anyone feeling like this is the end of the road, that this is a damaging situation if breast milk is unavailable. The human capacity for adaptation is amazing. It's if I can't breastfeed, if I live in a culture where I don't choose to, or it's not part of the norm of my value system, or if I can't, then other variables of attachment may be emphasized. So that lactation is one way, and a natural biological way. But there are other roads into the pathway of gleaming and beaming and developing the child's brain if that isn't available to me. So I don't ever want the listener to leave feeling that we are hopeless, because we are so adaptive. Babies in the intensive care nursery who spend months in there sometimes can still develop attachment, even though it is different in its start. Its outcome can still move to a trajectory that is quite resilient. So hopefulness is a part of this conversation.
Et pour revenir après sur les troubles alimentaires pédiatriques, l'enfant a diversifié son alimentation et maintenant, les parents rencontrent le problème de l'enfant qui est très limité, sélectif dans ce qu'il veut manger. Et ça devient une bataille autour de la table. On a des repas tous les soirs. En France, on a vraiment des repas en famille. Et ça devient à amener une disharmonie dans la famille. Comment lier certains troubles pédiatriques d'alimentation, je dis bien certains, avec le trauma développemental? Et quelles sont les approches qu'on pourrait aller visiter? Alors, bien sûr, il y aura la formation qui sera là pour pouvoir nous donner tous les outils, mais est-ce qu'il y a déjà des petites choses qui peuvent être déjà semées pour pouvoir aider à aider les parents à faire face à cette situation-là?
Absolutely. Nothing is more frustrating than not being able to feed your child. It's terrifying when your child won't eat, or when your child can't sit at the dinner table. Sometimes the origins of that come from the differences in the way the brain perceives texture of food, the capacity to manage food in the mouth. It may have a neural difference origination. Alternately, it may have an attachment origination. So just look at this picture for a second. You see here, mom and child look like mirrors of each other. The connection is the primary issue, and the food is just there. And the parent has cues in this image. Her eyes are big and open. The baby is receiving the message from the mom, you are the most important thing in the whole world. And baby's eyes are not on the spoon. Baby's eyes are on mom. The spoon is secondary. Children who experience fear of food for the sake of food, okay, when it doesn't go well in the relationship, you can see, like in this image, where the baby's fear in their body, look at the baby lean away, pull away from the food, but their eyes are on the caregiver. So the caregiver's worry around food or force, anger, frustration gets paired with the food. And the child's fear of eating may not be about the food at all, but from the cues that came in the relationship along the way. And this is why we say developmental trauma shows up in eating disorders, and how neurodiversity sometimes ends up being a interruption in the relationship. So it's really this mesh of variables that we observe. And so we have to treat both in our work, in our psychosensory intervention. Now, some kids, they self-soothe with food. And this is an idea or a suggestion that I'm soothing me because I'm not getting it from somewhere else. And that might be a red flag to think, they might not be feeling safe and secure in their relationship, and they may look to food to get it. That is an option in our assessment. And so what do? We treat it all. We help, and in this picture, we help kids feel food, feel comfortable with food, and feel comfortable with relationship. So this holistic approach isn't just about exposing kids to the right sensations, grading the food that we present to them. It's about helping the parent regulate themselves in the context of feeding, so that the feeding dance contributes to the safety of the food. And that is an example of intervention.
Oh, merci beaucoup, Kim. Ça ouvre vraiment tout un autre pan de pratique. Donc, vraiment hâte de pouvoir partager ça aussi avec mes collègues, nos autres thérapeutes qui sont francophones, qui ont du mal à pouvoir accéder à toutes ces connaissances qui sont en anglais. Donc, on a la possibilité là de l'aborder avec la langue française. Et donc, c'est vraiment une chance de t'avoir ici et de t'avoir venir en France. Donc, merci beaucoup. Merci, merci. Et
Merci.
puis, À très bientôt.
À très bientôt.
Au revoir, Kim.
Au revoir, Gwen.